Welcome to More Than a Refresh, a podcast about data and the people who wrangle it. Today I'm speaking with Jordan Lewis, Director of Engineering at Cockroach Labs. Jordan, introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Jordan. Like you said, the director of engineering for SQL at Cockroach Labs. I've been in the engineering world for just about 10 years. And at Cockroach Labs, I've been working with the different teams that build SQL in CockroachDB. And I live in Brooklyn. I'm a Brooklyn, New York native, and I've basically been here for my whole life. Except with the exception of I lived in Chicago for about 4 years for college. But besides that, I've been sort of a New York native my whole life.
So let me get this straight. You went from New York to Chicago. Isn't that kind of a political, not good thing to do? I mean, when you look at the old school movies and stuff, there's always Chicago versus New York versus Chicago. Are you considered a traitor amongst your peers?
That's a great question. It maybe depending on who you ask, that could be true. I think I like New York quite a bit. I like Chicago quite a bit too. I think Chicago and New York, Chicago's a great city. I wouldn't say it's necessarily, I'm going to offend somebody in Chicago now. I wouldn't say it's necessarily like New York so much, which is kind of why I ran back afterwards. But it's a great place, a beautiful place. It's got that lake, which is fantastic. A lot of outdoors things to do there. And yeah.
So one of the things I've been to both many times, especially New York, because we help run the Postgres conference series, which is the largest conference series for Postgres in the world, and our flagship is in New York, our flagship event. But I remember the company doesn't exist anymore, but I was teaching Postgres at this company in New York years ago. This had to be over a decade ago. And one of the things that I remember so much is looking out the windows. I'm in the skyrise and everything's flat, just completely flat. And I was thinking to myself, you know, how far can you bike or walk or whatever until you realize that you have to turn around and make it back to wherever you started, right? Because it's easy to walk 20 miles if there's no hills.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It's entirely a different thing to walk 40 miles, right? So at what point does your body say, hey, you really need to turn around or you're going to be sleeping in this park or wherever it is that you ended up at? That was the thing about Chicago that always caught me. That and the wind. The wind was just astounding. But in New York, the thing that's always struck me, unlike Chicago, and I'll probably offend some people in Chicago, and I'm okay with that. I don't care if I offend people. I'm actually secure in myself. One of the things that I really love about New York is the food, right? You can anywhere you're walking, you can find a bodega or you can find a small restaurant or a deli or all kinds of any ethnic differences, whether it be Cuban or Italian or Asian or whatever. Whereas in Chicago, at least my experiences in Chicago is that, I mean, you got pizza and you got pubs, and that's not bad, but occasionally I don't need a pizza and a beer. I just need some pasta or some, soup or whatever. And that was my experience between them.
Absolutely. Yeah. I would say that when I was in Chicago, one thing that really surprised me at first when I was first living there was that there's all sorts of interesting things to do in Chicago, but they're separated by enormous amounts of residential stuff. And if you're a New Yorker, you're used to be able to sort of walk wherever it is that you want from thing to thing, and you'll probably find something new and interesting along the way. And in Chicago, you end up walking through a lot of residential spaces, which is interesting, but there's not as much like commercial stuff or things to draw your eye or spaces that are not just residential. And while I'm on the topic, I will say I like where your head is at regarding bodegas. My go-to bodega sandwich, I would say, it's a turkey and Swiss with spicy mustard, lettuce, and tomato. I'm curious if you've got go-to bodega sandwich, just since you brought it up.
Actually, I don't. And for me, the experience, and I get out there, wait, pandemic aside, I'm usually out there 3, 4 times a year. For me, it's all about finding the unique restaurant. So there's actually there's two of them, but the one that I visited is up by 46th, I think it is. It's called QI, and it's a Thai restaurant. And they have a soup that essentially has every piece of meat. I mean, it's got rabbit, it's got pork, it's got lamb. I mean, all in it, and this. uh, It's an amazing soup. In fact, it's so good. We have actually looked here because in Canada, in BC, there's a huge Asian population. In fact, Asian is the majority population, and you can find all kinds of different Asian, restaurants, whether it be Korean or Thai or whatever. And we've actually looked for this soup because usually, you get the standardization, right? There's always orange chicken somewhere. But this soup only exists, as far as we can tell, in this restaurant. It's in Hell's Kitchen. It's called QI, and it is just fabulous.
Dang.
And that is what we do when we're out there. We're always looking for the restaurant. The bodegas are awesome. We love them because it's real quick to pop in and get whatever it is that you need, so that you're not eating out every single meal. Um, but I've been there enough to where I'm not a tourist anymore. I'm a visitor, which is
Hmm.
different, right?
Hmm.
When you go your first, say, half a dozen times, you're a tourist. You're always going to Central Park. You're always going to the Met, or whatever. Whereas with us now, I mean, our one of our favorite things to do, and I can't remember the name, but there's a park on the water that is near the aircraft carrier. I can't remember what it's called.
The Intrepid.
The Intrepid, yeah, and we'll walk that, right? That because we get so overwhelmed by the city that is New York, right? All the tall buildings, all the noise, because of where we live, it's just so different for us.
Hmm.
Um, but so that park actually introduces kind of a residential or a homey feel, right? There's trees, there's grass, there's green, there's water, the air is clean, that kind of thing. So
Absolutely.
that's kind of where we're at now with New York, is that we're visitors, we're not tourists.
Makes sense. Look, I'll tell you this. Next time you're in New York, call me up and I'll show you around Brooklyn. It's a very different feel, a lot of more relaxed things. I could never live in Manhattan myself since I grew up in Brooklyn. Feels like Manhattan, I do have that same experience that sometimes people say that they do about Manhattan, where it's so crowded, so busy, noisy, air quality, etc. Brooklyn, it's a bit of a different place, and I'd love to show you around it sometime.
Yeah, I mean, the most that I've ever been in Brooklyn, we ran a couple of conferences at the Marriott, the Brooklyn Marriott, right by the bridge.
Hmm.
But that's as deep as we got, right? Is that we're at the hotel a couple of blocks around it, and I know that Brooklyn has kind of seen over the last decade a resurgence, and there's a lot more local flair in terms of food and culture that could be very enjoyable.
Absolutely.
So let's talk about Cockroach a little bit. Now, as a Postgres person, I know that Cockroach uses the wire protocol, and of Postgres, and one of the advantages for you guys, of course, is by reusing that, you don't have to rewrite drivers and such.
Hmm. Hmm.
But one of the things that you said, you corrected me. I said you were director of engineering, and you said director of engineering SQL. So talk to me about that specifically. I mean, what are the language dialects that Cockroach speaks?
Sure. Yeah, it's a great question. So you mentioned we're Postgres compatible on the wire protocol, which is definitely true. We're also Postgres compatible for quite a bit more than just the wire protocol, although it's a little bit harder to put lines around that because Postgres, as you know, it's such a wild, wonderful, large, and mature, robust kind of SQL dialect. That being said, we've done our best to try to implement a lot of the things that people are used to when working with Postgres, like their virtual tables, their catalogs, the way that they have PG catalog and information schema set up in a certain way so that drivers can use them in the way that they like. And besides that, also like the actual SQL dialect that we use is quite a bit Postgres inspired. There's some features that we have that Postgres doesn't, but for the most part, for the things that are standard, SQL standard kind of things or industry standard kind of things, we would pick Postgres to be compatible with, as opposed to, Oracle, SQL Server, MySQL, that kind of thing.
What do you think are the advantages there in terms of, obviously, I mean, I've been in the Postgres world since 1997. I wrote a book for O'Reilly about it, or co-wrote, I should say. So I'm obviously a PostgreSQL fan, but what is the advantage that Cockroach is seeing by providing at least some level of compatibility that would make people feel more comfortable as a Postgres versus, say, a MySQL, which has a larger installed base?
That's a good question. I think that the community of Postgres is stronger, at least anecdotally. I'm not as involved in these communities as you are, it seems like. But just anecdotally, it feels like the Postgres community is really mature and robust, and people that I speak with mostly, maybe MySQL does have a bigger install base, but in terms of vocalness, in terms of people who are talking about what they're used to, we see a lot more Postgres people, I guess, than MySQL people. Also, I guess on just from a sort of technical side of things, or just this is also kind of anecdotal, but I would say that the Postgres, what we've seen from Postgres is more consistent. Just technically, there's less quirks, fewer quirks, I should say, I think, than in some of the things that you find in MySQL or some of the proprietary SQL dialects.
Well, I would agree with you on that. One of the things about Postgres is that, for all of its frustration, which there are plenty, it's consistent, right? It's consistent in its frustration versus, say, a MySQL or an Oracle, where it's so driven by client demand that you get weirdness, right? You get things that you would expect to perform a certain way. For Oracle, a really good example is how they handle null. In fact, they have been so chastised by how they handle null that in their official documentation now they say the behavior in the future will go away because it's broken. Right? They have publicly admitted that their handling of null is broken. So I definitely understand the idea, since PostgreSQL is not driven by a company, it's driven by, well, now lots of companies. It used to be by more of a community, which, all mature, successful open source projects eventually become, company driven. And it's kind of like an unsaid thing in open source that you're not supposed to talk about, is that the successful projects are all being driven by a company or a corporate demand on some level. And that's okay, right? Because that's why we have Linux where it is now. This is why, if you talk about Linux, a lot of people say, well, the most installed cell phone operating system is Android. No, it's Linux. Android is just another distribution of Linux. And it's because that's why it's successful, is because it's had that drive by people who are achieving, economic means by it, right?
Absolutely.
I mean, that type of thing. And on that, now correct me if I'm wrong. I sometimes get this confused, but as I understand it, Cockroach is not technically anymore open source. Is that correct?
Yeah, so I think according to the OSI definition of open source, we are not that. We have a source available license, I think is the technically correct word to use. That being said, I think, I think that's important for us for various business reasons. Since we're building Cockroach Cloud, which is the hosted version of CockroachDB that you can use. It can be take your database to different clouds and things like that. But I think the thing that I just wanted to mention is that for me, a big part of the reason that I like Cockroach Labs and CockroachDB so much is that even though it's a source available thing, the open source core, like the meaning of open source as work available for people to look at and study and learn from and discuss and find bugs in and submit pull requests to, that very much draws me to this product and this company. And I think, honestly, it's drawn a lot of the folks that we've got at Cockroach to the company, just because people share that ethos. People want to build something that lasts and that people can ultimately better the industry with, if that makes sense.
Sure, and understand that there's, from my perspective, I don't care if it's open source. In the sense of an ideologue, right? It's Cockroach's code; they can do whatever they want with it. And if people don't like that it's not open source, they don't have to use it. I do think that the Cockroach approach has merit in terms, especially as since I've been around for so long in this industry, I've seen how I'll never forget having a conversation with well, I'm not going to say the company, but an extremely large hardware vendor for telecommunications, talking about how we were negotiating a contract at the time because we were going to do some consulting for them. And one of the things the command prompt does is that if you are a client of command prompt, you agree that anything that we build, now of course your trade secrets and your confidentiality, all that is protected, but anything that we build that is of a generic nature is automatically relicensed to us so that we don't have to reinvent the wheel every time because of the industry we're in, right? And we absolutely respect, business secrets, trade secrets, all that stuff. So we're not looking to, find something of particular value and just open that to the world. It's more like, I don't want to recreate this backup script yet again. But this large vendor, they said they're huge proponents of open source. And I said, well, how? And their response was, well, in consumption, we love it. That's a quote. And the problem there is that, consumption of open source is great. I mean, that's what we want, right? We want lots and lots and lots of open source users because we want that freedom, that liberty that is provided by that. But if you don't contribute back, I mean, open source is an organism, it's a society, right? Just like anything that you do, your neighbor, he might need a wrench. You offer him the wrench, and in exchange, he grills up, a hamburger on the grill next time you're around, whatever. But there's some kind of equitable, cost sharing there in life. And open source is the same way. So if you're only a proponent in consumption, there's a serious problem there because you're starving out the ecosystem.
Yeah.
And I know why Cockroach went the direction that it did. I get it. But I'm kind of curious how you compare it, because if you look at something like who I would consider probably your number one competitor in the space, which would be Yugabyte, right? They stayed completely open source. And again, this isn't a judgment. It's more of just a consideration and discussion around what is the draw to not staying open source. What is the value there for Cockroach?
Yeah. So ultimately for us, it's about protecting ourselves from the internet giants. And you probably know who I'm talking about, but
Of course.
companies that want to take the open source software and, legally, of course, and ethically, I would say to some degree, and host it for themselves and get the hosted profits, so to speak, right? So it's about taking a database like Postgres and turning it into Amazon Aurora and getting the money out of that arrangement and making it very hard due to network effects and due to the developer love that they do have to some extent. I mean, I would say to quite a bit of extent actually, and taking that developer love and using it to make it impossible for those software vendors to innovate in their own way, right? If we are making Cockroach Cloud, which we think is the best way to run Cockroach DB, and the reasons for that are manifold. We've made this database and we know how to operate it the best, of course. We can also make it multi-cloud for you. If you have a business where you're interested in making sure that you don't have vendor lock-in issues with AWS, Azure, GCP, whatever it may be, you want to host it on your own environment, whatever, you want to do some hybrid model, whatever, we can of course make that happen for you. But some of these, the internet giants, the cloud providers have vested interests in making it impossible to do some stuff like that. And we think by, making these licensing choices, this BSL, business source license, we call it, by using that, we can avoid some of these negative problems and make it more likely that we can stay around as a business and develop the best Cockroach DB out there for our users.
So that's interesting. I'm not sure that I agree 100%. Not that it matters, but I do get where you're coming from. Speaking of, let's just point out the obvious. We're talking about Amazon, right? And there's a large, especially in the open source industry or ecosystem or community, however you want to put it, there's this fear of Amazon. Now, we do a lot of work with Amazon, and I definitely can see, from our perspective, you take something like an RDS PostgreSQL. We have a lot of clients on it, and they're amazed that RDS actually doesn't solve the problems, right? The only thing that RDS does is remove your need for a systems engineer, right? It doesn't remove your need for a DBA. And it certainly, unless you're building something on a small scale, it doesn't, frankly, causes more problems than it solves, if you want the truth. Because where we end up making money is people come to us and they're like, well, we've got RDS and we're doing all this stuff and it's broke. And our response is to go in and look at it and say, well, your problem is you're on RDS, right? Because you've outgrown it. And their response is, well, let's go to Aurora. I'm like, no, that's really not going to solve your problems. They're so good at marketing. Amazon is so good at marketing that they have created it's like Microsoft in the 90s, right? Linux was around, Unix was around, Mac OS was around, but Microsoft had so dominated the narrative that there was no other option unless you wanted to be a rebel, right? And I think that's what we're seeing now is that Microsoft, for example, now their argument or their pitch is we won't compete with you, which is a great way to approach it, because Amazon, what they're going to do, and this is just capitalism in general, they're going to identify what makes money and they're going to create it. Another company that is similar to yours that used to be open source and now isn't is MongoDB. And what Amazon did, the moment MongoDB switched and they said, no, we're going to protect ourselves, which for Mongo, they've done a great job. They're highly successful. They're public. I don't particularly appreciate their technology, but from a business perspective, they did a great job. But Amazon just said, okay, well, we're going to slap the MongoDB, I think it was 2.0 API onto Postgres. Now, Amazon doesn't announce it as Postgres, but DocumentDB is just basically Postgres with a MongoDB API. That's all it is. And so there's definitely a consideration of, okay, how do we protect ourselves, like Cockroach is doing, to enable us to continue to engineer and build. But it is not, as we've discussed, it's not open source. It's a different thing. And I do think that there is a noted, documented, proven method for open source to succeed, even with the Amazons, which it continues to, right? Because the software market is $3 trillion a year, and the cloud market is only 300 billion. So there's a huge gap, $2.7 trillion of where we can share money, to build out something like a Cockroach. And you say, Cockroach Cloud, and you're willing to do multi-cloud, you're willing to do hybrid cloud, all that type of stuff, is where it's at. My concern, and again, I'm my concern is the technology gets lost, right? The idea gets lost. How does Cockroach deal with, because you said to yourself, one of the things that draws you is this constant, let's learn from each other, we're still source available, those types of things. But doesn't the academic kind of education that happens through open source, doesn't that kind of get lost in the cloud, in a cloud deployment? Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah, I hear what you're saying. I think that's a very good point. It's a very interesting one, and it's definitely something that I haven't thought too much about. But I think just from like an emotional perspective of what does it mean for us to interact with technology, I would agree that when you interact with a cloud service, it's a very different feeling that's evoked in you as a developer. When you're working with a cloud service or an API, even if it's running something that's open source, source available, whatever it is, it's a very different kind of feeling. It's like I was thinking about playing with software the other day because I was I don't know how this came up, but I somebody linked me to this old poem written in Perl. Remember Perl? It's called Black Pearl, and it's this just goofy little thing, right? It's a little poem. It's very funny. You can execute it. It just returns nothing, but it's this very creative thing. And like the Ruby community is also a very creative, fun-loving community that's all about playing with software. And of course, that's part of how I got my start in this whole thing. And I imagine for many people it is like, why do you get interested in this thing that's now this huge business? It's because we all like to play with software and we like to program and we like to mess around with stuff. And I guess the point is that, like, I don't know, in the world of business and the world of cloud services, absolutely something is lost. There isn't that much playing when you're working with a cloud service. But I do think that with Cockroach, I mean, I personally am so committed just as an individual in trying to make it possible for people to still know that there is this open or source available Go database thing out there. You can go to GitHub. You can look at, we have a starting, our open source contributors start here kind of thing. We've got some good issues for people to take a look at. And why do people do that? Why would anybody want to do this since we are a business? The answer is to learn about database technology, to figure out how SQL works, to figure out how KV works, storage, Raft. I mean, I think of when I talk about to people, why should you, why should you join a company like Cockroach Labs or any other database company? For me, it's because databases are this microcosm of all of computer science. Any old problem that you can think of in computer science, pretty much it's going to live somewhere in the database. Compilers, machine learning, distributed systems, storage, whatever, you name it, it's going to be in there. And so for me, just thinking about how do you make this industry continue to attract the smart people who really love to play with software and learn about stuff like this is kind of part of the answer. So I don't know. That was a bit of a ramble, but I think it's kind of relevant, right? The playing is still there with these source available databases.
So, okay, fair enough. I mean, there's never one answer, right? If there was only one answer, then we wouldn't have proprietary and open source and free and source available. And I mean, shareware, if you recall, you brought up Perl. So, and I'll be honest, my feeling is that, seeing you in the Zoom meeting briefly, you're quite a bit younger than I am. And you remember Perl struck me as just funny because I was writing apps in Perl when it was still Perl 4. I know the maintainer of Perl 5 that refuses to allow that monstrosity to die. And Perl 6 never went anywhere. Everyone kind of moved on to whether it be Ruby or Go or Java or whatever. But I remember I was doing a presentation about open source for the ACM at Northern Arizona State, and this was forever ago. I mean, easily 10 years ago, maybe even longer, honestly. And I remember asking the whole room, do you guys know what Perl is? No one raised their hand. And I said, what about Tickle? One person raised their hand. And the reason they knew what Tickle was is because they were doing some Python experimenting, and Python's default is, TK. It's not that it was Tickle, it was the TK portion of it. And I remember I was so astounded. It was the first time I'd actually ever presented to an academic group, right? I normally stay in the professional realm. And it was astounding to me. They all knew Java, right? They all knew, and that's what they were being taught. They were being taught in computer science via Java. And this is when Java was still a Sun Microsystems thing before Sun imploded and got bought by Oracle. Um, and it was astounding to me how non-academic academics have become. It's no longer about, especially in computer science. I can't speak to the other disciplines, but in computer science, it's not about computer science. It's about learning .NET or learning Java,
Mm.
right? And even now, if you take databases are very, you'll see some Postgres, but mostly it's MySQL. So not only is academic lost its academics, it's not even teaching proper technology, right? Which is terrible, right? I mean, to me, if you really want to build the better brain trust in a nation, for talking about the United States, you wouldn't be teaching MySQL, you wouldn't be teaching Java, you'd be teaching concrete process, right? And when you talk about databases, you'd be teaching, I mean, Oracle would be fine, DB2 would be fine, but obviously my preference would be Postgres. But you would also have things like advanced classes on distributed databases, where Cockroach would come in, where Yugabyte would come in, where PostgreSQL would come in, or even the old Ingress, if you remember Ingress for a while. Those types of things where you can actually understand the technology that's involved. Nowadays, what I see, because one of the things we do is we run the Postgres Discord channel, so we got 3,000 people there, almost. And you see people come in and they're like, please do my homework. I don't care about the database. I'm in a web developer class. I just, tell me what I got to do so I can move on to the next chapter. Which to me is, there's a point where we're going to lose our brain trust, right? Because of that. And when you talk about something like a Cockroach, especially, you guys are solving problems, or trying to solve. I'm not going to say you're solving them, because that I think that would honestly be unfair. I would say you're attempting to solve and have had some success at some of the hardest database problems that exist, right? I mean, you talk about you're the highly evolved database, or the most highly evolved database on the planet. What does that mean?
Yeah, that's a good question. When we say that, what we mean is that Cockroach is the next generation of databases. I think the way I think of the very rough 4 categories of the history of databases is that we like to use the word legacy. Of course, that would be a little bit rude to Postgres fans, but since we think about single node databases, we think of that as sort of the old school category, the legacy category. We have the NoSQL category of databases. That was this reaction, right, to the difficulty in scaling these original databases horizontally. But of course, with NoSQL came a lot of compromises, a weaker query language, limited support for transactions, and anything else that you can think of in that NoSQL category. And the third category, I guess I would think of, is the cloud augmented old school legacy databases. So I guess Aurora is the poster child of that. That's about taking a database and putting some distributed stuff inside of it somewhere, but not really architecting it from the ground up. And then I think in Cockroach, and you mentioned Yugabyte, there's a few other ones, but in this newer generation of databases, think of it as cloud native distributed SQL. And that's just about databases that have been built from the ground up to support the sort of agile scale and ease of deployment, ease of use of the database that allows you to, as a developer, use SQL that you're used to from the old school world. Let's move away from that word legacy, but the old school world, right? Without having to think about, okay, how am I exactly going to do this scaling part? Like, what do I have to do to make this happen? I think of, you asked highly evolved database on the planet. It's all about being able to use SQL, however you wanted to originally without having to think about the fact that under the hood, this thing is going to be able to scale out transparently to multiple regions all around the world without you having to really intervene.
So I think it's funny how you dance around like old school and legacy, which I appreciate. I do. But I actually have a retort for you.
Sure.
And that would be, how about just standards compliant?
Sure.
Because that's what you're actually arguing, right? You're saying that old school and legacy, which actually isn't old school and legacy, it's just standards compliant. So in for you young bucks, in the distributed world, you're inventing things, right? And I think that one of the hardest parts for old school developers, uh, our Birkenstock, large beard wearing fellows of the DBA basement. There's certainly sacrifices that are made when you go distributed, right?
Mm-hmm.
And those are sacrifices. I remember sitting in front of a Linux user group. I was giving a presentation, and they were like, This was during the time when System D was coming out, and they were all the old school guys, and were just like, this is stupid. Why are we doing this? Why are we doing it this way? I can't believe they did this. And it's really a lack of foresight. Now, has System D gone too far? Yes, in some ways, but on the other hand, it's a modern system for dealing with problems that we had in the Linux ecosystem that people didn't want to address. People would say, well, why do we need System D? I said, well, first off, the thing can boot up 10 times faster. And the old guys would be like, I don't want my systems to boot up 10 times faster. Well, that's why you're going to be retired, right? It's a different world now. Now, when you're dealing with distributed databases, you've got a particular problem. We have a latency issue and we have an ACID compliance issue. How does Cockroach deal with either of those, or both for that matter?
Sure. Yeah. So great question. ACID compliance is, we think of as a crucial part of building a cloud native distributed SQL database. So meaning the next generation of SQL, you cannot compromise on that, because with compromise on ACID comes basically inability to use a database in an effortless, transparent way. I think we saw that pretty clearly with NoSQL, at least in my experience. I would say that trying to use NoSQL, which has this, relaxed consistency, lack of transactions, trying to reason about that as an application developer, not even as a database nerd, which I guess is what I've become, just trying to reason about it as an application developer becomes kind of impossible. You always are second guessing. Oh, did this data get into the database properly? Was there some race condition that happened? What did Cassandra or something do under the hood to make the data not what I was expecting, right? So definitely ACID compliance, consistency is a crucial thing that we've built into CockroachDB. And I would say the way that we've been able to do that is really just, following the academic community. There's some innovations that we've made in terms of academic innovations, but really the crucial thing for us was, thinking about how to build transactions using Raft, using the modern distributed systems technology, thinking about how to build SQL on top of a KV store, which is ultimately what Cockroach is. Under the hood, it's a distributed monolithic key value map that has consistent transactions, serializable consistent transactions. And on top of that, we've architected a SQL language, execution engine, optimizer, schema management that translates SQL queries efficiently into gets, scans, deletes, etc. on a key value database. So long story short, it's crucial. You cannot have a database that isn't ACID compliant. And in our opinion, it goes a little bit further than that. We also think that serializable transactions, so the strongest form of consistency, are crucial for developers to be able to really easily work with their data.
So a couple of things there that I just want to peg on. Serializable. And for those of us who are not database people, serializable is what allows you to properly handle a shopping cart, for example, so that the transaction status, the data within the transaction is properly serialized so that you don't buy something or put something in your cart uh, and then someone can take it away out of your cart right before the transaction ends. So I agree with you, and that is actually being able to support serialized transactions, especially in an ACID compliant way, is a one of the most difficult database problems that exists, and b to do it distributed in the way that you do is fascinating. And if I wanted to geek out a little bit more, we could probably spend hours talking about how you pulled that off. Um, the curiosity for me though is, I mean, you've you're very polite in your criticisms, which I which I love. Right? But it's funny that people are like, you can't do this, you can't do that with the NoSQL crowd. And what happened with the NoSQL crowd is that they built all this really interesting stuff for for developers, for front end developers, JavaScript developers, things like that. And they made this following of people that literally don't know what they're doing. And I don't mean that as an insult. It's just the truth. I mean, you had a bunch of people who didn't understand databases that built a database, realized all the mistakes they made, and then started building all the stuff that we already had in other databases, like ACID compliance, proper
Mm-hmm.
transactions,
Mm-hmm.
those types of things. Cockroach said, we want to build something, well, next generation, which is something that has evolved past our traditional monolithic database experience. And you're right, Aurora. I mean, what Aurora did basically was move all of its one has a different storage layer than the standard Postgres. That's the big draw, is the way they handle their storage. But the Azure stuff is the same way. They built their own storage engine. Now, what's interesting about Microsoft and what they did with Postgres is they also bought Citus, and what Citus, and then they turned it into hyperscale, right? That's which is a silly marketing term because it
Mm.
already existed before they turned it into a brand. But they have hyperscale Postgres, which is federated, horizontally partitioned, however you want to put it. How would Cockroach compare or even compete, right, in terms of the technology that you're delivering to our developers versus, say, a hyperscale and the technology they're providing? Where's the line where Cockroach is a better choice?
Sure. Yeah, it's a great question. So I will say I'm not super familiar with hyperscale at all. I guess you're saying that it's kind of Citus, but
It
rebranded?
is well, hyperscale is their hosted
Okay.
Citus cloud
Got it.
thing, right?
Got
So
it.
it
Got it.
is Citus. It's not different. I
Okay.
apologize for that.
Oh no problem. I mean, I'll say the same thing about Citus. I am not a Citus expert by any means. I think that what Citus asks the user to do, and you should correct me if I'm wrong here, is that Citus asks the user to figure out the right partitions ahead of time. Isn't that right?
To some degree, yeah. I mean, it's definitely a layer on top of Postgres,
Yeah.
and you're limited in some of the SQL you can do,
Yeah.
and the partitioning is certainly better if it's predefined.
Yeah, yeah. So I think that Citus, right, it's this layer on top of things, and I think it can translate what you've asked it to do as a user into physical layouts in a clustered Postgres kind of thing, I think.
Yeah, I mean, they have distributed tables, right?
Yeah.
And they have a C store and things like that. But it's, how can I put this? The real question here is, if you think of Postgres as distributed, okay, it's not, but let's think of it as something
Hmm.
that is distributed. It has a slightly sanitized SQL dialect because you got to deal with the distributed nature of data, right? Why would Cockroach be, I mean, obviously you're natively distributed.
Yeah.
So what is the value there versus just, because everyone talks about scale out, but the reality is 99% of the people out there don't need to scale out.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. No, this is a good question, and it really does come down to what you said, which is that the distribution replication is built into Cockroach at the very ground level. And what that means to a user is that when you make a table and you insert data into it, and you have a workload that's pointed at the table and the tables, the database will do the sharding, so to speak, for you. We don't talk about sharding in CockroachDB because it's all handled completely transparently from the user. The database detects things like tables getting large. We call them ranges under the hood. Underneath a table is several ranges, and a range is just a set of data in order. And CockroachDB detects when ranges are getting large and splits them up, and that's all. That's all there is to it. It's not like a super complex thing to describe. But from the user's perspective, you don't have to know what a range is. You don't have to worry about in what dimensions your data is chunked up and split around and replicated. You can really just interact with the table as you would a monolithic Postgres instance. And I guess I'll say one more thing on that, which is just that you don't the lack of predefinition is really what I would say is the big advantage to CockroachDB Cloud Native Distributed SQL. Not having to worry about splitting things up ahead of time, not having to architect your very application around thinking of these shards ahead of time, and God forbid you have to increase the number of shards or something like that. I've heard a lot of horror stories around that moment where it's like, okay, double the shards day. What's going to happen now?
So that's interesting. So as a database person, I'll be perfectly frank. Everything you just said offends me. The idea that I wouldn't think about what my data is doing, where its dimensions are, where it's sitting, where it's living, the fact that there's some magical, Wizard of Oz that arbitrarily decides based on somebody's idea of proper when to shard or horizontally partition a current data set automatically terrifies me. It absolutely. I mean, I'm sitting here, my toes are curling over the idea that this just magically happens.
Okay, so as well it should. I will say as well it should, but we don't stop with that. This is the default that Cockroach will give you if you say, I want to have a cluster of CockroachDB instances that live in a single data center or a single rack or something like that. Maybe it isn't so important to organize the data according exactly to your whims, but you can do that. You can get as fine-grained as you want with replica placement. And this does become a lot more important, as you can imagine, when you have a database that has instances in multiple data centers or multiple regions where latencies between those regions are non-zero or non-negligible. And CockroachDB gives you all sorts of interesting abstractions to use to control the data placement of replicas without having to do it on a per replica basis ahead of time, that kind of thing. But I would say that it's kind of like what's that phrase? It's like make the easy things easy and the complex things possible. I totally butchered that, but that's kind of the philosophy that we use for the replica placement stuff.
No, that's fair. So I want to get back to Cockroach, but I do want to. This is an interesting, as my teenage daughter would say, an interesting factoid. And the reason she says that is that I finally had to threaten to ground her for using fun fact. I did. I was like, if you use fun fact again, you're grounded. And she's like, interesting factoid? I'm like, okay, fine. Just no more fun facts. You are an outdoorsy kind of guy. And you are in the process over the last 20 years or so of trying to conquer all of the 46 Adirondack peaks. Is that
That's
correct?
right. The Adirondack High Peaks. So I grew up like I said in the beginning, I'm a Brooklyn native, and for me, that meant thanks to my wonderful mom and dad that I got to spend a lot of time in the Adirondack Park, upstate New York, which is a giant state park that is a beautiful place to spend a lot of time. They have a lot of mountains there. We call them mountains here on the East Coast, but these 46 mountains are above 4,000 feet, which I know is not particularly crazy for those of you on the West Coast, but here on the East Coast, it's pretty meaningful. And yeah, so there's this goal. You can try to climb all 46 of them, and they're hikes. And I've been working on that, since basically I was, I don't know, 9 or 10 or something like that. So just a couple of weeks ago, I made it back up to the Adirondacks for the first time in, I think, since the pandemic started, basically. And yeah, managed to knock out another one. So I'm pretty excited about that. I'm up to 35, and hopefully when I do get to that 46, I can have some sort of exciting outdoorsy celebration of it all.
So yeah, I mean, for everyone who listens on the West Coast, we're like 4,000 feet. That's not a mountain, and it's interesting because it's true. I mean, I'm at sea level right now, but I can literally drive 30 minutes and I'll be at 8,000 feet, and that will be the trailhead, right? So it's definitely a different perspective, and I'm right near the North Cascades National Park, so we
Mm,
get that. They call it the American Alps is what they call it.
mm.
Um, and so I do think it's interesting because when you think about New York, right, nobody thinks about the fact that New York is a huge state, right? They think about New York as a very dense island called Manhattan. And there is wild opportunities to enjoy nature, hike, backpack, and there are some places that are uh, outside of the scary places of New York City. There is some in inhospitable places nature wise for humans in New York. So I think it's awesome that you've kind of set this goal. How long do you think it's going to take you to get the last 11?
Well, I will say that the older I get, the harder they seem to be getting, unfortunately, especially during the pandemic. I mean, I don't know what your experience was like, but for me in the pandemic, working from home, you just are a lot less active. There's a lot less reason to go for a long walk necessarily. And I just feel like I really lost a bunch of fitness, and it's bumming me out. But this was a good, I guess, a good wake up call in a sense. We did this hike. It's called Mount Esther. That was the one that we did just a couple weeks ago, and it was tough. I was like, oh man, this is intense. Like I need to get my fitness back in shape. And you mentioned the elevation stuff. I think on average, I think the 46ers, it's like they're low, but they also start kind of low. So it's like, I don't know, 3,000 feet vertical or something like that on one of these hikes. And I don't know if that's a lot. I don't know if it's a little. The trails are pretty steep. They're pretty rocky. They're pretty rooty. And yeah, so I guess you asked, what did you ask? You asked how many more years until I'm done with this thing. And I guess I would say maybe 4 to 5. That would be a good target, being
Okay.
realistic.
So you brought something up which just I love. It just the older you get, the harder it gets. That's absolutely true. So I used to backpack all the time and hike all the time. And when I say all the time, every other weekend I was on a backpacking trip, and I would hike multiple hikes a week at a minimum. Um, but as I've gotten older, I actually need a new ankle. I didn't know
Mm,
that they could replace ankles,
mm,
but they can replace ankles. And I can't backpack anymore. I can't do the weight. My ankle won't let me. So we've moved on to using a schoolie, which we talked about briefly before we started recording. And a schoolie is a converted school bus, and we have a short bus, so it's a 5 window. And the pandemic, although I will agree with you on the fitness thing, because I'm in my late 40s, and I haven't seen a number one as the first number on the scale in a decade.
mm.
And that's a problem. Let's just be very clear. I really should be seeing like a 1.8 or a 1.9 as the first two numbers, and I'm not even close. And the pandemic very much accelerated that. Now, but we didn't have the same effect as a lot of people because I've worked from home for over 20 years. So the pandemic didn't change
Mm.
that for me. But what did happen is we found ourselves out in the schoolie quite a bit more, because, when the pandemic hit, nobody wanted to go to the grocery store for obvious reasons, right? And so what we did was we went out to Moab,
Mm.
Utah, right? And we went to the Grand Canyon, and we went to Yellowstone, and we went to Tombstone, Arizona, um, because it was, what better way to social distance
Mm-hmm.
than to not be around people at all. And we were blessed. None of us caught COVID. For those who did, I hope you made it through fine. For those that didn't make it through fine, what do you say? But uh, the reality of the pandemic, what did happen, and I agree with you, is there was a lot more couching,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's just now over the last 2 months that, and I don't know if there was like this cultural, societal, hidden, how there's trends in society that get picked up for whatever reason. And at one point there was YOLO, right? You only live once.
Mm.
And thankfully most of the people that, YOLO are no longer living because they only live once. So it gets picked up, right? And I think with the pandemic, what happened was that with the rise of delivery I actually live in the country. I have 10 acres, and I can still have Whole Foods deliver anything I want within 2 hours.
It's wild.
It is. It's crazy. But I think the rise of that and people being literally afraid of other people, right? That a lot of us who are normally very active, normally would get out and do the things that, keep us healthy, didn't,
Mm.
for whatever reason. And I think it became it. I don't think it was conscious. I don't think, you didn't sit there and say, I'm going to get out of shape during this pandemic, or at least I
Exactly.
hope you didn't,
No, no,
right?
certainly not. Yeah, I think it's
um,
just a combination of we had a lot of fear, right, early pandemic, and then for some of us we had a work from home adjustment. I certainly did. I was used to commuting 45 minutes a day or so, or one way by subway, and getting rid of that. It doesn't mean that you don't go outside, but it definitely, if you don't think of going outside and you have done your grocery shopping, some of those days you don't go outside, and then you wake up and you're like, oh my god, did I not? How many days has it been since I left my house? And that starts to get dangerous.
no, I agree with you. I mean, when you start having to think about when the last time you showered was, right? Because you don't care, because you're not interacting with any other person. That's a definite, you know, I guess a red flag, right? You got to start thinking about the things that you're doing. So we're getting a little long, which is great. We'd love to have these conversations, but I do want to bring it back around to Cockroach a little bit, because that's why we're here. Uh, Cockroach, the language that's written is Go, correct?
Yes, Cockroach is written in Go.
So that's interesting to me, because I'm going to make a proclamation. Go to me is a dead language. Now I know that there's all kinds of people that are now howling at the moon, calling to cancel me because I said Go was a dead language. But the reason I say it is that any language that the primary contributor is a for-profit organization is, to me, a dead language, because a it removes the ability to actually organically grow.
Mm.
Right? If you take like a C or C++, there's a standard, but there are, a dozen compilers out there for it. A bunch of different implementations. The two that are most famous, obviously, are LLVM and GNU. I think even Intel's compiler, I could be wrong on this, is now considered deprecated in favor of those two.
Mm.
But the world seems to be moving on from C++, which is good because it has some inherent flaws, and moving on to something like a Rust.
Mm-hmm.
Now, for those that don't know, I'm sure that people have, a lot of us listening or participating have at least heard of Rust. But what's interesting about Rust is that it was actually created by the Firefox, right? Mozilla, the Mozilla Foundation. And it's becoming, it's a language that's interesting because you can't break it, right? If it compiles and runs, it's doing what you said it would do. Whereas with a C, and a good example would be the old school Perl, you could write something and think it was going to do something, and it would do something completely different.
Mm.
With Go, how don't do you feel that there's a technical debt there? I mean, and when I say this, what I mean is eventually you're going to hit a wall that can only be serviced or solved by that other organization because you chose Go. Is there a debt or a cost to that, or are you is Cockroach confident in the Go ecosystem, as they say?
Yeah, it's a very, very good question. I admit I did scream and shout a little bit silently when you said that Go is a dead language. I don't think it's a dead language, but I do see what you're getting at. I think, so when we picked Go for CockroachDB, I think it was in 2014 or 2015, a little bit before I joined. I think the founders were scarred by C++. I think that I probably have heard that come out of one of their mouths. And they wanted to try something different. They thought that Go was a promising language, and they picked it for that reason. They also, Rust wasn't around at that point, or it was extremely young. So it wasn't really an option at that time. I think that Go, I really like working in Go because it's a language that allows you to move between these two modalities of thinking. One that's, I want to get stuff done. I want to be living in a world where I can kind of program stuff just in the way that I want to, like a Python, maybe like a Java, maybe, just without having to think so carefully about performance every single moment. Since even in a database, there's lots of parts of the database that aren't performance critical. And they're very complex, business requirements, a lot of weird logic, a lot of difficult stuff. But performance isn't really the thing. And for moments like that, I really value Go's simplicity, I would say. And then it allows you to also think about that performance sensitive stuff pretty easily too. So that's kind of why I like writing in Go for CockroachDB. To answer your question in particular, though, I guess one moment that one anecdote I'll give about difficulties that we've had. If you're familiar with Java, you probably know about, there's this tool called YourKit, which is this really, really awesome closed source tool that you can buy that allows you to look at the heap of your Java program in real time as the program's running, but understand the object graph and the trends in the object graph and what parts of the object graph are retaining what memory ultimately. And it allows you to do incredibly powerful stuff with these tools. You can do it in a live process or in a dead process that had a core dumped. And coming from my last job, I was working in Java, and I kind of considered that table stakes, to be perfectly honest, because it was just such an incredibly powerful tool to figure out what was going on with memory. In a database, you probably know memory, crucial resource in a database. It's all about memory management. Let's say you have to do a big global sort of all of your data. It's so important that you understand where all the memory is going, so that you can decide to spill to disk when you run, you don't have enough memory to finish a global sort of 2 terabytes of data in your node. So you've got to figure out when to spill to disk, how to partition all the memory for the different concurrent queries going on and stuff like that. There's all sorts of complexity there. And sometimes when you have a bug that you're working on, trying to understand, gasp a bug, right? Trying to figure out what's going on, trying to figure out how to improve a situation. A lack of a tool like that can really, really hurt. And bringing it back around to Go, the Go folks have made a tool that allows you to do some of this introspection, but just because of their own business priorities and their roadmap, they just haven't been able to maintain it. And it's kind of rotted. And so I worked a little bit recently on improving it and sprucing it up. And, I have some patches that I'm working on with some of the folks on the team there, and they've been pretty receptive. So I would say, it's a mixed bag. Like I really like working with the folks on Go on stuff like this, but just the fact that they don't have time to necessarily maintain a tool like that does sometimes make me a bit nervous.
Okay, that's exactly what I was thinking, right? Was that when you don't have a large global community to drive the ecosystem, and that's the power of open source, right? Um, Things can be deprioritized.
Yeah. That being said,
Um,
there are a lot of really great community Go projects that people rely on, like Delve, for example. Delve is the debugger for Go. And I think that Delve is purely community run, written, and driven. And everybody relies on Delve. And I think that's a pretty good example of how the Go community is pretty active, pretty resourceful and building those mission critical tools without the help of Google.
yeah, and that's, don't get me wrong. I'm not trying to take away from Google, but I mean, you touched on it, right? Which is they have their priorities.
Exactly.
And I think that, bringing that back around, and this is more as we wrap up, more of something to think about, is that yes, Go is open source, but they have business priorities that, on what's going to end up happening with that technology. The question is, what about Cockroach? Right? Cockroach has its business priorities, and obviously your business priority is going to be whatever in theory is best for your clients, right? Which makes perfect sense, and that's what it should be. But is there any decision that Cockroach has made that after the fact you're like, damn it, why did we do that? You know what I'm saying? I mean, everyone has it, but there's that one decision where you're like, we thought this was the way to go, and now I'm missing a foot and I've got a gun in my hand.
Yeah.
Right. So what is that one as we wrap up? What is that one thing for Cockroach?
It's hard to pick just one, to be perfectly honest. But one just that's super relevant to our conversation here is that when we started building SQL, so Cockroach wasn't always going to be a SQL database. It started out as that distributed key value map that I told you about with transactions. The founders realized that we needed to build SQL pretty quickly, but it wasn't instant. And the question was, what dialect are we going to be building? And in the very beginning, the founders thought, well, we should build a dialect that takes the best of both worlds from MySQL and Postgres, which sounds nice in theory, but in reality, a decision like that has a lot of downsides. And it turns out that, you mentioned right at the very front of the call, big advantage of having the Postgres compatibility is to hook into all those tools and drivers and ORMs that the community has made over the years. And trying to think that we could make a new dialect that was somehow better than Postgres or better than MySQL, better than everything, is a bit unrealistic. And I think that some of the code artifacts, some of the ways that, for example, the SQL type system works inside of CockroachDB has some baggage from that decision to not be Postgres compatible in the very beginning. We've switched and we've tried to be Postgres compatible. Sometimes, how it is. There's code that's been around. It's very important. It's hard to change. And there's a little bit of, we're saddled with a little bit of regret, I think, from that initial decision to be something hybrid.
It's interesting. That's a very good point. And what kept popping in my head as you were speaking about that was NIH. Not invented here. And the PostgreSQL community is terrible about this. This is why they don't have an issue tracker. It's why they don't use pull requests. They are so hung up on this is how we do it. They refuse to learn the better practices. And yes, I said that, not him. For anyone who's listening, I said that, and I'm willing to stand by it because I've been in the community since '97. But I think that one of the things, especially as founders, and I'm a founder, right, is that you think to yourself, I can do it better. And a lot of times we who have this inspiration that I can do it better forget that there's been 1,000 people before you that said the exact same thing and ended up at the exact same point, which is, why didn't we just use Postgres or whatever in the first place, right? And so I applaud Cockroach for learning from that experience, and I applaud them for, look, you had to have SQL, you knew that, so that was good. And then learning from you can't really pick the best parts between Postgres and MySQL, especially because MySQL's broken. So you're literally picking the best parts of something that's broken. Why would you do that? With that being said, hey, is there anything that you would like to add to the conversation before we go ahead and cut this off?
Um, I don't think so. I think, I hope that you all try out Cockroach DB, especially Cockroach Cloud serverless. This is our, serverless Cockroach DB thing that we didn't really get to talk to, but it's really cool. We think it's the easiest and fastest way to get started with Cockroach DB. It's also free forever, so there's no obligations, no credit cards. You can get a free serverless Cockroach DB just by going to cockroachlabs.cloud. But yeah, I hope you try it out. I also hope, if you're listening and you really like you like learning about databases, I encourage you to check out our GitHub. There's just so much you can learn about databases by going to CockroachDB's GitHub and looking at good first issues and stuff like that. And what's more, I'll just give a very quick plug. Every Friday at 3 p.m. Eastern time, I actually do a Twitch stream about developing CockroachDB. And so you can tune in, you can come and ask your questions, and learn what it's like to work on a distributed database. And that channel is called Large Data Bank. So if you search Large Data Bank, you can find that show. So I hope to connect with some of you there.
That is actually, I did not know that, and that's great. I think that anything that we can do to help educate people is always a good thing. It's one of the reasons we do this podcast. It's one of the reasons we do PostgreSQL with all the webinars, even through the pandemic. There is one final question that I have that I really actually did want to touch on, especially now that we're in a situation where the employee has more power, for lack of a better word, than the employer in a lot of cases nowadays, especially in the tech industry. And Cockroach was named one of the best places to work in 2021. And outside of my general distaste for these kind of lists, what would be, as a closing comment, the number one thing to you as to why, as a lifestyle, that Cockroach is a great place to work?
I'll name a couple of things if you don't mind.
Yeah, please.
I think that what we were talking about in terms of learning and teaching, that's central to the culture of engineering at Cockroach Labs. It's a very collaborative place. It's a great place to come and learn about distributed data. It's a self-selecting group. It takes, you have to be interested in this stuff to want to work at such a company. And so I think coming to work there gives you a bunch of like-minded folks who are kind to each other and want to learn and teach each other. On top of that, I guess, the remote work culture, that was something that we had at Cockroach Labs even before the pandemic. It's something that we're continuing to live. I think it works very well. We love fully distributed remote culture. I guess last little thing I'll plug there is, on Fridays, we have sort of a Flex Friday policy, which is our version of Google's original 20% time. And on Fridays, everybody at the company is given latitude to work on something that isn't directly the same thing that they're working on for their roadmap. Maybe it's a new experiment, or maybe it's, learning about something else in the database that they didn't know about, or maybe it's, just if you need a data recharge, you can take that too. I think that that's just a fantastic part of working at Cockroach Labs, and it's something that I would really dearly miss if I ever left. That's, for example, the only reason that I've been doing this Twitch stream that I mentioned is because we do have that Flex Friday. That's what I do on my Fridays. And man, that's just been such a great part of my life. And I think that there's been a lot of things that people have done on Fridays that make them excited to keep coming to work at Cockroach Labs.
Okay. Well, for those listening, this was Jordan Lewis, Director of Engineering SQL at Cockroach Labs. We look forward to having him on again in the future. And thank you for your time.
Thank you so much. This was fantastic.